It is our pleasure to welcome back to the show. I think this is the first time he's actually joined us from America. Last time he was joining us from Qatar, but it is our good friend Sebastian Salazar, ESPN FC. There is so much soccer news, men's and women's side. Sebi, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be with you, and great to be joining you from the States this time.
Yes, we don't have to figure out a time difference to Qatar.
Oof, that was brutal, man. We were starting our work days at midnight and then going until about 8 a.m. local time. And then we'd have to go to training in the morning and watch all the games. So talk about working 24/7. But, man, what a blast that was. I think that was one of my favorite work assignments of all time.
Yeah, it's the World Cup. It's pretty good. Are you going to Australia and New Zealand for the women?
I'm not. We're definitely sending some people, on behalf of ESPN. We were talking before the break. I just had a kid, so the timing didn't necessarily work out in that regard. But we'll have full coverage on ESPN FC, Football America, as my colleague Alexis Nunez is going to be kind of the one spearheading the coverage on the ground over there.
Gotcha. So let's start with the men. We do now know, unlike at the start of the show, we do officially know the roster will be announced for the women tomorrow. So we'll get to some of the decisions that Vlatko Andonovski has to make for the Women's World Cup team with just 30 days until that tournament starts in a little bit. But the men this weekend, they win the Nations League title, and amidst that, there's bigger news in that Gregg Berhalter is coming back. I'll just ask you without giving my opinion, without doing anything, just what did you make of the decision to return to Berhalter after this extensive search?
Well, I think you have to question whether it was an extensive search or not. And I think that's really kind of where the frustration comes in for U.S. fans. U.S. Soccer had this press conference. It was very odd on Friday morning, where it was effectively the brass of U.S. Soccer trying to explain why they had brought Berhalter back, while Gregg Berhalter sitting there also getting questions about, getting the job, which should be a highlight in his career. Very awkward. And I think you go back to kind of how everything melted down after the World Cup. There was the dispute between Gregg Berhalter and Gio Reyna, and then Gio Reyna's parents famously getting involved. There was not the allegation, the admission of domestic violence from Gregg Berhalter that kind of came out of that. He admitted to it on Twitter in kind of a hastily created, unverified Twitter account. That set off an investigation at U.S. Soccer, at which point everybody thought, okay, Gregg Berhalter didn't necessarily convince everybody as a manager, but with the domestic violence on top of that, there's just no way that this guy's coming back.
Yeah. And not just the accusation, which was 30 years old, but the chaos it created.
Yeah, and I think what really it underlined, not to downplay domestic violence, that's obviously kind of the headline, but really, what people talked about coming out of that was not the act of domestic violence. It was the idea that Gregg Berhalter had been blackmailed, which, by the way, never actually happened. It's actually a lesson in very effective PR from Gregg Berhalter and his crew to announce and admit that you committed an act of domestic violence, and everybody came away with it almost feeling like Gregg Berhalter was the victim. So I think Gregg Berhalter at that point, people thought, look, this is just clean for everybody to break away. You bring in a new sporting director. U.S. Soccer announced that they had hired a consulting firm to kind of help them with this new coach. All this money goes into it. You're sure that there's going to be a different outcome. And yet, at the end of what we're forcefully told is a very extensive search. And when you have to say it so many times, it makes you doubt it. You end up with the same guy. So I think there's a lot of frustration just in terms of the process and then the ambition. We're coming up on the 2026 World Cup. This is the best generation of American players by far, and American fans wanted to see the federation swing for the fences with a big name, and that didn't happen here. Bringing back Gregg Berhalter very much feels like business as usual.
Yeah, and yet there's a lot of support from players. And Sebi, this is where I am honestly torn, because I came out of it going, the thing that starts the downhill spiral of all the actions you just described is a coaching decision by Gregg Berhalter to not play Gio Reyna, which Gio Reyna is one of the best players in the program. That to me was not a way to set your team up for success, keeping a talented player off the field, especially one who could generate goals when your problem was scoring goals. And oh, by the way, there was like 2 or 3 other roster decisions that were questionable at best. We talked about them at the time of players that he left behind for that World Cup. So there were football reasons to not go back to Gregg Berhalter if you want them. Yet, Christian Pulisic, he's like, we're all behind Gregg. He's built an incredible culture. We want to move forward with him. Even a guy like Ricardo Pepi, who was one of the players I am talking about, one of the players who's left off the roster, is like, I support Gregg Berhalter. Why is it that the players are so behind this, and how do you factor that into the analysis?
Well, let's start with Pepi, because What Pepe said after Gregg Berhalter was named is what you're talking about.
Right.
2 months ago, he was talking about hanging up on Gregg Berhalter when he told him that he didn't make the team and not having spoken to him since. I also think just generally, like, we have to take a grain of salt. If your general manager at 980 had left the company but might be coming back, and somebody in public asked you, hey, how do you feel about such and such? Well, if there's still a candidate to come back, you can't hammer the guy. You can't say, no, we're going to move on. You're putting your place and your relationship with a manager in jeopardy. That's not to say that there aren't some players who genuinely respect Berhalter, may have wanted to see him come back, may have thought, hey, this guy isn't as bad as what everybody out there is saying. We quite like him here, and we don't necessarily want to change. But I think it's too much to say that there was like universal player approval of this coach. We had Joe Scally, who was one of the guys that made the World Cup team but didn't play under Gregg Berhalter in Qatar. And he told us flat out a couple weeks ago, before we knew Gregg Berhalter was coming back, we need a coach that doesn't treat this like a club team, that treats this like an international team. And there's a huge difference there. And we all heard that and we were, oh, that's a shot at Gregg Berhalter. So it was not unanimous. It was not even unanimous within U.S. Soccer. There was one member of the board of directors that didn't sign off on this. So there was, I wouldn't want to say internal fighting over this. I think they were much more on the same page internally than externally. But there was not unanimous support of Gregg Berhalter, even at the federation and even in that dressing room.
Sebastian Salazar, ESPN, of course, ESPN FC. You can check it out daily on ESPN.com and on the ESPN app. So that's an interesting comment to me, the Scally comment, right? Because there is also growth of obviously players, but of coaches over time. Like, do you think it's possible that Gregg Berhalter learned from his mistakes as a manager in Qatar, and that he can actually be the right guy moving forward, and that the good things about him, because they did get out of the group stage. They did go further than the U.S. men had gone in a long time. He did complete the mission of getting them back to the World Cup and out of the group stage. So is it possible, in your eyes, as someone who watches this incredibly closely, that they can grow on the good stuff that he brings and achieve the ultimate goal of genuinely competing on home soil in 2026?
Yeah, it's worth noting that a lot of the negative reaction that you're hearing to the Gregg Berhalter hire is from the extremes, right? From what we all are fans, but fan is short for fanatic. And so you get a really kind of overwhelmingly negative opinions of Gregg Berhalter. If we look at his resume coolly and the work that he did, he took a program that missed a World Cup back to a World Cup and was the only team from this region to get out of the group phase at the World Cup. And if you look at how they played, they may not have scored a ton of goals, but they played very well, especially in the game against England. I think that's what everybody holds their hat on, that the U.S. went toe-to-toe with one of the teams that most people saw as the World Cup favorite. So there were plenty of footballing, soccer arguments to bring Gregg Berhalter back. There's obviously the argument for continuity on top of that. He took a very, very young team, and where other managers would have said, you know what, let me mix in some veterans so we definitely survive qualifying. He said, nah, I'm rolling with these young guys. I'm going to blood them. And to some extent, he can probably turn to the federation now and say, hey, if I got you to the World Cup with kids who had never done it before and we performed decent, what do you think I could do now that they're established at the international level? And that's what he talked about in his press conference. Gregg Berhalter, no matter what the internet tells you, is not a bad coach, and he's not a useless manager. The question here is he the best manager for this time in American soccer? Is he the guy to maximize this group of players? That, I don't think so. Can he get this group a little bit further than he did in Qatar, considering that it is a home World Cup? They're going to have a great draw. They're going to have a probably great path to at least the quarterfinals. Yeah, I think expectations should be raised, even if you don't think that Gregg Berhalter is the perfect candidate. He's a good coach, and working with the same players more, he should be able to get even more out of the team.
So the other element of that is they're going to have better players, and we saw that over the weekend. I mean, the U.S. has been in search of a goal-scoring number 9 forever. Balogun comes in. He scores in the final. Like, what did we learn this weekend about this U.S. club winning their second straight Nations League title?
Yeah, there was, first of all, on Balogun, man, there was just so much hype. You know, we were talking about it in soccer circles, trying to think the last time there was hype like this around a guy before he played for the national team. And it was a short list, like Christian Pulisic and then Freddie Adu is basically like how far back you have to go. Why is there that hype? So he chose between England, Nigeria, and the U.S., and he was pretty far along with England's program, which, of course, is better than the United States. On top of that, he's coming off a season where he scored 20 goals in a top 5 league in Europe. The list of Americans that had done that before, Valerian Balogun, 0. So he's already kind of a historic prospect. And then to your point, what was the U.S. lacking at the World Cup, man? They had all these playmakers on the wings and in the middle, but they didn't have a guy to finish it off. They were rotating that striker position. And when you're talking about an attack, goals come from that spot. This guy has them. And you saw not only the goal that he scored in the final, good to bring up, of course, goal scorers got to score goals. I think what you also saw in the whole tournament, right, this whole semifinal final, the game against Mexico, the game against Canada, he both starts, is that he's a real threat at the number 9. And he takes the other defense's attention, and that allows Christian Pulisic a little bit more space, Tim Weah a little bit more space, Reyna a little bit more space. And you give guys of that talent space against the level of defenders that they're going against, especially in this region, the games we saw, Mexico and Canada, they're just going to light them up, bottom line. And so you saw a very dangerous Pulisic, a very dangerous Weah, a very dangerous Reyna. And on top of that, Balogun scoring. This attack is now by far the best in the region. And I think it can start to believe about being the type of an attack that can really create problems against good international teams when you get to the knockout rounds of, the World Cup in 2026. But don't forget, in 12 months, we got Copa America, which is North and South America, the continental tournament. That's going to be happening here in the States as well.
Yeah, and Sebastian Salazar is our guest, of course, ESPN FC. I guess that leads to like this big question. And if we're doing a soccer podcast, like this is not a question you're going to discuss because people listening to that know an answer. But like on a broadcast radio show, like this is the ultimate $1 million question or $1 billion question is like, okay, what does that mean on the world stage?
Right.
Because Pulisic is he's still like 24, I think, maybe 25. Reyna's 20, Balogun's 20, 21, like Weah's young. Like all these guys are still incredibly young. Musa is maybe he's turned 20 by now. He was 19 at the World Cup. Like they're so young, yet have experience, whether it's club, top 5 league in the world level, World Cup, or both. And I haven't even named like 3 other guys that also fit that bill. By the time we get to 2026, with these players gaining more experience, becoming more prominent in their clubs, and ultimately, Sebi, as you well know, there's more players coming in this pipeline that could be coming into the U.S. program. Can they legitimately get to a place where they're competing in Copa America next year and then are having, round of 16, semifinals, finals expectations in 2026?
Well, let's tackle Copa America first, because we can just look back at 2016, the last time that tournament was here. The U.S. made the semifinal, and that was a much different, not just U.S. team, but U.S. talent base, right? Where the guys were playing, what they'd achieved at club level. So playing a home tournament, you can kind of dream big. So I think for the Copa America, which is a good projection for the World Cup, we can safely say the way that they've played, they should be in the semifinals again at home. Now, what happened the last time they got to the semifinals? They got just destroyed by Argentina. And so the big question is, when you run up against an Argentina or a Brazil, who are going to be the class of that tournament, what's the gap? Is the gap such that over 90 minutes, maybe you could pull the upset? Or is the gap what it was in 2016, where there's just no chance, right? You're going to get washed off the field. I think the gap has shrunk dramatically. So I think for Copa America, you can say semifinals. And I think for the World Cup in 2026, because the U.S. will be a host, and that'll very much influence the group they fall in and therefore the draw, you can dream quarterfinals and potentially semifinals depending on the matchup. This is a generation that's going to be coming into its prime. They're already playing at some of the best clubs in the world. And to your point, there are kids right now that we don't really know about, that we're not really talking about on kind of the mainstream stage, 19, 20 years old, who are just breaking into major clubs in Europe. And if 1, 2, 3 of those players go on the Christian Pulisic track, now you're talking about a starting 11 of significant players in the biggest leagues in Europe. And if you've got that, and you've got a home World Cup, and you've got a coach that knows how to manage a tournament, which will be the big question, you can make a run. I think winning the World Cup in 2026 is still a little pie in the sky. But if you can make the semifinals, man, you're 180 minutes away. At that point, it's kind of like getting to the Final Four in March Madness. Like, you truly got to believe that you're playing well enough that everything can happen.
Right. And the other thing is like this group, as we just mentioned, is so young that you then look at, okay, well, where's this World Cup going to be in 2030, and can we compete then? As this group is probably young enough to play in at least 3 World Cups, the Pulisic's, et cetera, of the world. All right, speaking of World Cups, the next one is not 2026. It is in 30 days. It is in Australia, New Zealand. The women take the field. We are going to learn the U.S. roster tomorrow. It has been reported already by Meg Linehan at The Athletic that Aubrey Kingsbury will make the roster from the hometown Washington Spirit. Kelly O'Hara, former champion with the Spirit, is going to make the roster. And the big surprise is Savannah DeMello, who is a phenomenal midfielder, attacking midfielder for Racing Louisville. She's been one of the best players in the league all year, but hasn't really been a lot with the national team. And that narrows down to what else, can happen with that roster. So I know you did a video today that's all over ESPN.com, kind of the toughest decisions that Vlatko has to make. What to you are the 2 or 3 biggest ones that are going to impact how this team does in the other side or on the other side of the world?
Yeah, I mean, Savannah DeMello is a really interesting case because, like you said, she hadn't been with the national team in a while, but Vlatko Andonovski, the manager, was super clear, both publicly and privately, that NWSL play, right, your play with your club team, would not influence. It would dictate what happens at the World Cup, who will make the team, and then how many minutes they'll play. And so he's staying true to his word there. He's also acknowledging that he's got some problems in midfield, right? He hasn't really figured out what the best player combination or necessarily tactic is to get the best out of that American midfield. I think that's where the biggest questions are, Julie Ertz is this player from the past that is supposed to come in and kind of be a panacea, right? A fix-all for those issues. But this is a player that didn't play for the better part of 2 years since the Tokyo Olympics. So what kind of impact could she have? And, even her, she's been injured for quite a while with Angel City FC. I think up top, you're looking at a pretty clear pecking order. You've got Alex Morgan, who's going to have to lead the line. There's a lot of depth at those wing positions. There's some interesting choices there, but they're more depth. I think for me, the biggest questions are on that back line because the rest of the world is caught up and they have quality attackers. We know Becky Sauerbrunn, who is the 37-year-old kind of veteran leader of the team, is not going to be there. I know that's a big blow kind of in terms of what you think of, you want leadership in that defensive position. But I think it solves an issue for Vlatko Andonovski. He can now look at that center back and say, all right, you know what? I'm going to play my 2 youngest, most athletic players, maybe an Alana Cook, maybe a Naomi Girma, and kind of solidify the back line there. There's other players at the wide positions. I think Sofia Huerta's one for me. I really hope makes the team because she brings a lot going forward. Another player that's done great in the NWSL. But it's always a problem for the American coach. There's just an abundance of talent, and you got to do your best to try and pick the right players. I think most of his 11 is set. It's how does he manipulate those pieces, and what does he do in midfield? Lindsey Horan, Rose Lavelle are stars, but they're not playing like stars for the U.S. And so I think that's a big, big question for Vlatko Andonovski.
Yeah, of course. I'm horrendously biased towards Ashley Sanchez and what she can do because she's someone I consider a friend. Yep. But her, Savannah, there's so much talent in the youth movement. And obviously we'll see Andy Sullivan and where she fits in with Julie Ertz and all of that. But do you think that there's a major surprise that gets left off this roster? So far, the only one we know who's left off that's a surprise was Becky, but that was 100% injury related. But whether it's, hey, Rose Lavelle's not going to make this team because she hasn't played in weeks, and, they're concerned about whether she's ready or for whatever other reason someone's not playing well in club. Do you think there's a big surprise of someone who's left off of this roster?
I think there's going to be some heartbreak. I look at a couple players from the National Women's Soccer League that have really proven themselves, and that's like Lynn Williams and Midge Purse. And those players both have kind of the same tools, and that's just straight line speed that you can't really coach and that you need now that Mallory, formerly known as Pugh, now Swanson, is out. That's just a huge blow for this American team. So you're going to need somebody on the other side. It could be Trinity Rodman for all our Washington Spirit fans. But I think one of those 2 players is going to be left off. I think Lynn Williams has 6 goals right now in the NWSL. She's top 5 in scoring. So it would be really shocking to see her left off. But at the same point, Midge Purse deserves to be in a major international tournament. So I think that wide position has always been really deep. But that's where you get those tough calls. And good players are going to be left off like they frequently have been for the U.S.
For sure. All right. We have reached our time. 2, we can hear Father Duty is calling in the background.
Yes.
So we will let you go. Sebi, always appreciate the time, and I'm sure we'll be catching up soon.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
You got it. Sebastian Salazar, everybody, with us here on The Hoffman Show.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's The Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.